Tonight, I'm going to be providing a brief introduction to the most common agricultural systems one might find on the rolling hills of the Palouse, and talking about some of the work that my coworkers and I do to help farmers and landowners implement conservation on their farmland. Many of the conservation practices that farmers are working on may go unnoticed as you drive by farm fields, but they're critical to protecting, enhancing our resources nonetheless. The conservation projects that we undertake here at Palouse Conservation District can be divided into one of four focus areas. The first one is conservation agriculture. We also work on riparian restoration, habitat restoration, and livestock management. The focus of tonight's presentation is conservation ag, and I won't be talking about the others, but all of these areas are linked and they're vital to protecting our landscape. The objectives for all that we do in conservation ag are centered around protecting water quality within the Palouse River watershed and the Lower Snake Toucan watershed, improving soil health, protecting air quality, and enhancing habitat for wildlife, pollinators, and other beneficial species. When financial assistance is available, our projects are funded based on the priorities that are identified in the Palouse Conservation District's long-range plan. Our top three current priorities are soil health and erosion control, water quality from all sources, including agricultural runoff and urban stormwater, and replenishing the landscape. And that means wildlife habitat, native prairie, pollinator habitat, and aesthetics. We generally have far more project ideas and funding requests than we do available funding. And so we're always looking for new opportunities to obtain funding for project and find ways to stretch our conservation dollars the furthest. The cropping systems on the Palouse are determined by the amount of precipitation received, and they can be divided into three main systems. So if you look at this map of the region, the area shown on the inset map, look at map A on the left, and that shows the historical weather data, with the area shaded orange receiving less than 12 inches of annual precipitation. The blue area receives about 12 to 18 inches of annual precipitation, and the green area receives more than 18 inches of rainfall annually. So then if you look at map B on the right, that shows the cropping systems of the Palouse. The area shaded orange on the map is commonly known as the winter wheat fallow or the low rainfall region. The most widely practiced rotation here is 2 years long, alternating between winter wheat and fallow. That fallow year is needed to store moisture in order to ensure that there's enough water available to produce a crop the following year. The fallow is prepared in one of two ways. The traditional way is to create a fine dust mulch fallow using high disturbance tillage methods to control weeds and create a mulch that helps to prevent evaporation and store soil moisture. The other way to prepare fallow is a chemical fallow, or chem fallow for short, where the soil and the crop residue remain undisturbed and weeds are controlled as needed with herbicide applications. This method is used in conservation tillage or in no-till systems. The area shaded blue is known as the intermediate rainfall or the transition zone. A typical rotation for this area is a 3-year rotation with winter wheat, spring wheat or spring barley, and a fallow year that is managed similarly to the low rainfall zone. The eastern Palouse is the high rainfall zone, the area shaded green, and this zone is typically continually cropped in a rotation with winter wheat, a spring grain, and a pulse crop such as chickpeas, lentils, or peas, or it could also be an oilseed crop such as spring canola. The general rule of thumb is that an average annual precipitation declines by about 1 inch with each 10 miles that you travel, beginning at the Washington-Idaho state line and going west. It's also generally accepted that for those same 10-mile increments, winter wheat yields will decline by about 7 bushels per acre, going from east to west. So the point here, you can see the maps are very similar. And so precipitation is really the driver for the cropping systems in our region. And that will also help determine the types of conservation practices that are implemented. The word clouds on this slide show the diversity of crops and livestock in Whitman County. And this was adapted from the 2017 Census of Agriculture. You can see here that wheat is king with nearly 4 times as many acres planted as the next most widely grown crop. There are multiple classes of wheat planted here, with the most popular being soft white winter wheat, used for pastries, cookies, and crackers. Hard red winter wheat is also grown, and it is used for Asian noodles, bread, and general purpose flour. Spring types of wheat are also grown, both soft white spring wheat and hard red spring wheat. The hard red spring wheat, you might also hear it referred to as dark northern spring wheat, and that's a high protein wheat that is great for artisan bread. Club types of wheat are also grown, and those can be identified out in the field by their compact head shape. The club wheat has similar uses as soft white wheat. At the time of this census, the next most popular crop was chickpea or garbanzo beans, followed by barley, both feed and malting types, lentils, and forage crops. Dry peas are also grown. Winter and spring canola has been grown for some time, and it is growing in popularity. Some other crops that you might find on the Palouse that are grown on smaller acreages would include sunflower, mustard, grass seed crops, oats, corn, flax, camelina. Farmers are always looking for new crops to grow in rotation with wheat, and the proportions of each crop will change with market and weather fluctuations. Whitman County is also home to some livestock operations, with cattle numbers being the highest. Sheep, hogs, poultry, horses, and goats are also produced. So you might wonder, how do we come to work with growers at Palouse Conservation District? What would be the process for planning a conservation project? Well, typically growers will come to us. They find us through outreach events, referrals from one of our conservation partners, or by word of mouth from their neighbors. It's important to emphasize here that our programs are strictly voluntary. We work with the people who come to us with their conservation concerns. So when a grower comes to us, we work with them to talk about their concerns and any changes that they want to make on their land. And then we identify their conservation objectives. The next step usually involves a visit to their land to collect information on their current conditions. And that would be to take an inventory and an analysis of their existing natural resources. Once that happens, then opportunities for conservation can be discussed. This involves deciding on the practices to implement and identifying any financial assistance that might be available in the form of cost share programs. What cost share means is that funding is available to offset a portion of the cost of implementing the practice, and then the producer or landowner is responsible for the remainder of the implementation cost. Finally, the conservation practices can be implemented, and those follow a set of technical standards that are usually decided by the funding agency. These standards are really important because they assure the quality of the project and that the funds are being administered responsibly. Following implementation, the project is then evaluated to determine the effectiveness and to ensure that the conservation goals have been accomplished. And so the first conservation practice that I want to talk about tonight is residue management. In our region that's dominated by agriculture practiced on steep slopes, residue management is the first line of defense toward protecting our soils from erosion. In the eastern Palouse, much of our effort is centered around preventing erosion caused by water on steep slopes. In the western Palouse, residue management is critical for managing soil erosion caused by wind. Soils are finer, there's generally less crop residue produced, and erosion is likely to happen when there's high disturbance tillage. The Natural Resources Conservation Service classifies much of our farmland here as highly erodible. And so it's important to protect our highly productive yet fragile soils from erosion, not only to maintain their productivity, but to keep soils from being transported to the streams of the watersheds and causing detrimental effects to water quality. The keys to residue management are minimizing soil disturbance and maintaining surface residue. This can be accomplished using conservation tillage and no-till or direct seed farming practices that we'll talk about next. A former colleague liked to call the transition from high disturbance tillage methods to conservation as a time to crawl, walk, run. And I really like this description because it truly is a transition. and that is mainly for one reason: straw. Here on the Palouse, we are blessed with the ability to produce abundant amounts of winter wheat residue, and managing all that straw can present significant challenges when implementing new farming practices with less reliance on intensive tillage. With reduced tillage, sometimes referred to as mulch tillage, there are fewer passes over the field with farm equipment than there would be with a system that uses intensive tillage. Crop residue can be managed with a single non-inversion tillage implement, such as a disc, a cultivator, or a chisel as the primary tillage method. And that would be one of those, not all three, with a secondary tillage using harrows. And in this picture, the harrow is attached to the chisel. That could also be a separate operation on its own. But that's used to spread residue evenly over the soil surface to help prevent erosion. Following light tillage, a lower disturbance fertilizing and planting method can be used. Compared to inversion tillage methods where crop residue is buried or with multiple tillage passes over the field, with mulch tillage, there's a greater likelihood of preventing erosion, building soil organic matter, and reducing particulate emissions to the atmosphere. Because the mulch tillage practice allows for some light tillage to manage crop residue, this stage could be considered as moving from crawling to walking when implementing residue management. When a grower is ready to move to the no-till or direct seed practice, they're often running. No-till is just that. There are no soil disturbing tillage passes to manage crop residue and prepare a seed bed for the next crop. With no-till farming, fertilizer is applied and planting is done with a single pass over the fields using a specialized drill. Residue from the previous crop remains undisturbed on the soil surface, and the root systems remain intact below ground until planting time. There's even greater protection against soil erosion over and above the benefits from the mulch tillage system that we discussed in the previous slide. And there's greater opportunity to increase soil organic matter and improve soil health. Wildlife benefit from no-till because of the undisturbed crop residue that can provide a food source and protective cover. And with no-till, because at least 60% of the crop residue cover is required at all times, crop moisture is conserved. Standing crop residue is more effective at trapping snowfall. And so that's an added benefit for saving moisture for the next crop. With minimal trips over the field, there's reduced fuel consumption by farm equipment. And no-till farming requires fewer types of farm equipment and fewer trips over the field. And so there's less of a labor requirement in a no-till system. So my title says no-till or direct seed. And so you might be wondering, what is direct seeding? Direct seed is a term that, to my knowledge, is only used in our region. In the Pacific Northwest, direct seed and no-till are sometimes used interchangeably to describe using one pass to seed and fertilize. Some define the term direct seeding to allow for two passes, with perhaps a low disturbance fertilizing operation followed by the seeding, or maybe the use of a light harrow for heavy straw management or to smooth the ground after fertilizing and seeding. So whatever the interpretation here, the important thing to remember is that this type of cropping system has been proven the most effective for reducing soil erosion and building soil health in our region. I mentioned in the previous slide that a specialized drill is required to seed and fertilize in a single pass. Just as the precipitation zones, the cropping systems, and the terrain are variable across the Palouse, so is the equipment needed to implement conservation farming. So I'm going to speak in very broad terms here. Drills can be classified by the type of seed opener into one of three very, very general groups. The first one is the hoe or shank type opener. And here's what it looks like in the field. This is best for heavier soils and high residue production. It can be good for transitioning from reduced tillage to direct seeding, and it does create a little greater soil disturbance out in the field. The second type is the disc type, and there can be single or double disc type openers, where the disc blade slides through crop residue to place seed and fertilizer. This creates less disturbance than a hoe type drill. And you see this one working out in the field. This happens to be a single disc type drill. And you can see there's very little disturbance behind the drill. The third type is the cross slot type. This is a very low disturbance seed opener, and it works by creating a horizontal slot below ground to place the seed and the fertilizer. This is what that one would look like out in the field. So you can see there's still almost all the surface residue is left behind the drill, even after seeding. No-till drills have evolved over time, and there's no one size fits all for every farmer. In the case of direct seed drills, it would be really rare to find two drills in our region that are exactly alike. Nearly every producer has customized their drill to fit their own needs. I would say that the choice of a no-till drill is perhaps the most difficult decision that a producer will make when deciding to implement no-till farming, because buying a drill is not as simple as just driving up to a dealership and picking one out. It involves a lot of research with trial and sometimes error before deciding on just the right one. So we talked about all the benefits of no-tilling, and you might wonder, with all these benefits, why hasn't it been more widely adopted? And I've listed here on this slide a number of the challenges to no-till adoption. The first one, initial efforts were unsuccessful in previous decades in our region, and this led to some reluctance by later generations to give it a try again. The picture of the drill in this slide is an old yielder drill. This was one of the first types of no-till drills in our region, and I found this one that was just left to rest in a sod patch. Thankfully, people didn't quit. There were pioneers in our region who persevered and continued to learn, so our knowledge has increased and the equipment has improved dramatically over time. We already talked about the difficulty in managing excessive winter wheat residue. This has presented and for some continues to present an obstacle to further adoption. The drills, no-till drills are quite expensive, the ones that I showed you in the previous slide, and there's a period of learning involved. Most growers try multiple types of drills with varying configurations before they decide on one to buy. There may not be just the cost of the drill, but oftentimes a grower needs to buy a new tractor with more horsepower in order to adequately operate the drill. And that way the conservation cost share programs can be helpful because they allow growers to try different drills and offset some of the expense and the risk in transitioning while they're learning and becoming more comfortable with a dramatically different farming system. Other challenges to no-tilling include determining the optimal seed row spacing and fertilizer placement and delivery systems. Those go hand in hand with choosing the right drill. There are changes in the soil environment when switching to no-till, and that leads to changes in soil-borne pathogen levels, as well as shifts in weed population that will need to be managed. Less labor is required in the field, but no-till requires a different type of management and a completely different mindset than a tillage-based system. And then the last one here is social acceptance, helping landlords to fully understand the benefit of no-till. Some may be uncomfortable with such big changes on their land, and no-till is still less acceptable in some parts of our region. This is changing, however. The USDA 2017 Census of Agriculture estimates that 55% of the farms in Whitman County are under either reduced till or no-till management. We know this number is increasing each year. We want to keep this momentum going because there's still plenty of room to encourage adoption of conservation tillage and no-till. There's no denying, and we've talked about it multiple times tonight, crop residue can present significant challenges to implementing conservation farming. But it is most definitely not trash. Here on the Palouse, burning of crop residue and baling of straw are common management practices for some growers. Now, burning is not an allowable practice in conservation programs, but both burning and baling of straw are tools that could be used to manage excessive crop residue, and they may even be used by a producer in the crawl, walk, run progression toward conservation management. That said, it's important to consider the entire system and the entire crop rotation when making the decision to remove straw. We already talked about the importance of crop residue in preventing erosion, especially when alternating high and low residue producing crops. Burning and baling are tools that will give an immediate return or a solution to a challenge, but it really just needs to be considered that repeated winter wheat straw removal from fields can lead to a decline in soil organic matter, and it also removes nutrients that could be released and used by subsequent crops as the residue decomposes. The next practice I want to talk about is nutrient management. The purpose of the nutrient management practice is to design a crop fertility program to match the nutrient applications to crop needs for maximum yield while minimizing the possibility for unintended environmental impacts. According to the National Ag Statistics Service, in 2019, only about 24% of the land planted to winter wheat in Washington state was analyzed for soil or plant tissue nutrient content. Some anecdotal evidence here in Whitman County indicates that value could be closer to 1/3 of growers who soil test regularly. But either way, there's a lot of room for growth in soil testing and using nutrient budgets to determine optimum fertilizer rates. The Natural Resources Conservation Service recommends the 4 R's of nutrient stewardship. And those are applying fertilizer from the appropriate source at the correct rates according to a nutrient budget and land-grant university guidelines, and at the most optimum timing for crop utilization, and also at the right placement for crop use and to avoid nutrient escape through either nutrient leaching or volatilization. With nutrient management, producers will typically work with a crop advisor from a local company, but some will also make their own fertility programs using research from land-grant universities and also the yield history from their own farms. An important part of this practice is record keeping, and that helps to ensure that nutrients are being applied according to budget and also to develop historical information that producers can use in subsequent years. When used as part of a conservation program, nutrient management is practiced simultaneously with conservation tillage or no-till, and this is to ensure that the soils are protected from erosion and that crop nutrients won't be leaving the farm fields as runoff or attached to sediment. The precision nutrient management practice builds on the basic nutrient management in order to further refine fertilizer management programs so that nutrients are applied to areas where they're used most efficiently and most effectively. In this case, fields will be divided into application zones with a minimum of 3 zones per field, as you can see on the map in the lower right-hand corner, the red, yellow, and green areas. And those are based on their productivity. A nutrient budget will be constructed for each of those zones, and then the nutrients will be applied using variable rates based on a prescription that's developed for each zone of the field. The field and the zone maps are downloaded, and the fertilizer prescriptions are entered into the computer found in the tractor cab, like you see here in the photo. And then the nutrients are applied using precision technology involving GPS. The zones are determined using soil test data, historic crop images, previous yield map data, and GIS layers. The purpose here is to avoid over-application on areas of the field that don't have the potential for high yield, in this case, the red zones, because that in effect would be wasting fertilizer. But we also want to avoid under-application of crop nutrients in the most productive parts of the field, in this case, the green area, so that maximum yields can be attained. Natural Resources Conservation Service defines IPM as a site-specific combination of pest prevention, pest avoidance, pest monitoring, and pest suppression strategies. IPM programs are designed to prevent or mitigate any off-target risks to water quality, soil health, air quality, plants, animals, and humans. Some examples of prevention would include cleaning equipment before moving from field to field, buying certified weed and disease-free seed, or using pesticides with varying modes of action in order to prevent pest resistance. A couple examples of ways to avoid pest problems would be planting pest-resistant crop varieties and using crop rotation. For example, the canola crop seen here rotated with winter wheat. Pest monitoring includes crop scouting, and that can be either with drones or humans, and using record keeping, and as well as looking at pest thresholds. And finally, let's see, lost my place. Pests, once there's suppression of the pest is warranted, then control methods such as chemical, cultural, mechanical, biological should be used judiciously in order to minimize off-target risks. Record keeping is essential to the IPM practice, and this includes keeping those scouting records, keeping track of any pest control applications, and any attempts to mitigate the effects of the control efforts. The application equipment, like the self-propelled sprayer that you see in the bottom center picture, that needs to be regularly maintained and calibrated to ensure that pesticide applications are accurate. The IPM, the Integrated Pest Management Practice, is a complicated and it's an important topic. Continued funding for research in this area is critical so that farmers have diverse solutions in order to reduce the risks of pests, both for the benefit of growers and the environment, and also to improve the resilience of our cropping systems. There's been a lot of interest in recent years in implementing cover crops in the Palouse region. With the cover crop practice, either a single species or a multiple species mix is planted. There are multiple benefits to cover crop implementation, and some of those are to prevent erosion when the cover crop is planted in between growing crops, to improve overall soil health, there'll be more on that shortly, to add fertility to the soil and build soil organic matter by adding plant biomass. The use of deep tap-rooted cover crop species can help to scavenge excess nutrients to prevent leaching, and those deep tap roots can also help to break up any compacted layers in the soil. With cover crops, soil structure and infiltration of moisture are improved, and cover crop species can also provide habitat for pollinators and wildlife. Once again, for the greatest benefit, cover cropping needs to be practiced simultaneously with conservation tillage. So I mentioned that there's been a great deal of interest in implementing cover crops on the Palouse, and there are a number of ways that producers are working to integrate the cover crops into each of the rainfall zones and into their cropping systems on the Palouse. Some of the ways that that could be done would be to plant the cover crop in between cash crops in the continuous cropping region. If you remember back, that was the green area of the map. Cover crops can be planted in an intercrop situation where the cash crop is planted at the same time as the cover crop. Another option would be to plant during the fallow period, and this would be most likely in the intermediate and low rainfall zones. Some growers are working to integrate livestock grazing with the cover crop, and that could be during the fallow or with the cover crop and the cash crop. It's important to plant that cover crop as soon as possible and terminate as late as possible in order to realize enough plant growth for soil health benefits. And no matter what the species, no matter what the producer's objectives, that's what's going to determine the kinds of species that the grower will plant and what the composition of the cover crop species mix will be. And some of those grower objectives might be to add nitrogen through nitrogen fixation. Cover crops can be used to interrupt pest cycles. They might be used to attract beneficial insects and pollinators, to improve soil biological diversity, and again, to reduce any compacted layers in the soil for better water infiltration. When I was preparing this talk, I ran across this cartoon from the 1920s, and it turns out that even way back then, they realized that diversified cropping systems would lead to greater returns. Yet, even today, we are still working to add diversity in the form of cover crops to our dryland cropping systems. And the reason we're still working at it is because there are a lot of challenges to implementing cover crops in our current cropping systems. A few of those challenges might be how to integrate the cover crops into continuous crop rotations. In the intermediate and low rainfall zones, there's concern that the cover crop might use excessive moisture, and this could lead to yield loss in the cash crop. There are still questions about what are the most beneficial species mixes, how many species do we really need, and what types should we be using? With livestock integration, some questions are when to introduce the livestock on the cover crop and how best to manage them. There are concerns about unintended introduction of crop pests, or that maybe the cover crop will serve as a reservoir to harbor those pests. We're still learning about optimum termination dates. And then there are economic considerations. There are costs involved with planting the cover crop. Some of the species are expensive and the seed isn't produced locally. And then there are also concerns about potential yield loss versus the benefits of the cover crop. There is a steep learning curve, but research is ongoing. Many growers are conducting research on their own farms. There's research going on at our universities, and then also private companies and crop advisors are contributing to research to help us learn more about cover cropping in the region. The expectation is that going forward, cover cropping is going to be an important practice toward mitigating climate change and sequestering soil carbon, but there's still a lot to learn before there's widespread adoption of cover crops in our region. For all the conservation practices that we've talked about up to this point, one of our goals is to improve soil health and the productivity of our soils. The NRCS defines soil quality, sometimes referred to, or soil health, often referred to as soil quality, as the continued capacity of soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. They go on to list 5 principles of soil health. And those are, first, to maintain armor on the soil for protection, and that's our crop residue and our cover crops. Secondly, to minimize soil disturbance, and that's through no-till direct seeding or mulch till practices. We want to promote plant diversity by adding different crops in our rotations, and that also includes cover crops. Number 4 is to maintain continual live plants on the field. Cover crops will help us to accomplish that goal, and perennial crops also help. And finally, to integrate livestock into our systems to create diversity for our dryland cropping systems. Really though, when we're talking about soil health, soil organic matter is truly the foundation. But in some parts of Eastern Washington, more than half of our soil organic matter has been depleted since farming began back in the late 1800s. For all the practices we've discussed and our focus toward improving soil health, anything we can do to build soil organic matter is going to be vital to improving the productivity of our systems. Soil organic matter provides food for the microorganisms in the soil. It increases soil aggregation to help resist erosion. It increases soil warming, and that's especially important for spring seeding, increases air and water flow, and improves nutrient storage. Soil organic matter helps to improve soil structure, and it makes soils more resistant to compaction and crusting. I want to switch gears here for a minute and talk about a program that's related to conservation agriculture. The FarmSmart Sustainable Agriculture Program is operated by the Pacific Northwest Direct Seed Association. Palouse Conservation District partners with PNDSA to conduct audits of farming operations for certification. The certified farming operations are working to implement regenerative agriculture practices. The purpose here is to provide additional value to crops and farms and to meet consumer demand for sustainably produced commodities. The farmers who've been certified up to this point have voluntarily implemented practices to conserve natural resources on their farms. This program provides a platform to educate stakeholders on social and environmental benefits of direct seed cropping systems. The FarmSmart program operates under a defined set of conservation standards that tie together all the objectives of conservation agriculture. And those are focusing on water quality, soil health, air quality, habitat, energy conservation, and economic viability of farming operations. Applications are currently being accepted, and more information on this program can be found on the Pacific Northwest Direct Seed Association website or from Palouse Conservation District. There are many other programs here at Palouse Conservation District that directly help to support our resource conservation. And those include our Education and Outreach Department for elementary students through adults, including K through 12 classroom activities, the annual Envirothon, volunteer events, the annual cropping symposium, and many workshops and outreach materials. Those are just to name a few. Our Research and Monitoring Department conducts water quality and soil health monitoring throughout the Palouse River watershed, including paired watershed studies and quantifying where conservation projects have been implemented and where they're still needed. The Volunteer Stewardship Program is a new incentive-based approach for Washington counties to participate in a watershed-based collaborative planning process that protects our critical areas while promoting agricultural viability. Farmers and landowners are invited to share their stewardship stories and the measures that they've implemented on their land. More information on this program can be found on the Whitman County VSP website. Before we go tonight, I want to take a moment to recognize our conservation partners. This is a really busy slide, and the work that we do here at Palouse Conservation District couldn't be accomplished without so many partnerships. And we're grateful for each of the partners that we have the opportunity to work with. This next slide is a list of additional resources. We went through these conservation practices pretty quickly. And so if you're interested in digging a little deeper and gaining some more information, the Palouse Conservation District website lists all of the programs that we're involved with and also contacts for staff members who can help you out with your conservation interests or concerns. The Pacific Northwest Direct Seed Association has information on direct seed farming systems, as well as the FarmSmart certification program. I already mentioned the Whitman County Volunteer Stewardship Program. If you're more interested in soil health, the USDA NRCS and the Washington Soil Health Initiative websites also have more information. The WSU Small Grains website is loaded with information on dryland cropping systems and current research related to that. And finally, the Pullman Plant Materials Center has a lot of information on cover cropping and cover crop species. On a personal note, the topic of conservation agriculture is of special significance to me, not only because of my role with Palouse Conservation District, but because I come from a long line of farmers. The kiddos you see on the right are the 6th generation of my family to live and work on a wheat farm in Eastern Washington. On the right, you see some of my ancestors in an old harvest picture. We are very fortunate to live in a region with some of the most productive rain-fed agriculture in the world. And it's critical that we continue to protect the deep, blessed topsoil that we are so fortunate to farm and protect these resources on the Palouse so that farm families like mine will be able to continue to work the land for many generations to come. And with that, that concludes my talk. And I think we maybe have some time for questions.